Hi everyone, this is the first chapter out of the Babby textbook, and we're going to talk about the basics of social research. A lot of what we do when it comes to social research is trying to figure out if or why something exists. So I have some examples here. How do we know that it's cold on the dark side of the moon? How do we know racism exists? How do we know if and why protests influence political change? The way we answer those questions is by engaging in empirical processes. And we do this through what we call methodology. So, methodology is a subset of epistemology, and epistemology is sort of the science of knowing. How do we know that something exists? Well, methodology is basically a subset of that. It's the science of figuring out if something exists. What we do in social science research consists of two things: observations of the social world and then explanations of our observations. So these two work in tandem. We collect some data, some observations of what's going on in the social world, whether they're direct observations like we're watching something happen or we're writing things down. And then we go back to those observations, go back to those data, and try to explain why we're finding patterns in the data. So, empirical social scientific inquiry is concerned with both observations and explanations. And like I mentioned before, the observation side of it is actually looking at the social world, what's going on, collecting data about these things, writing things down. And these can be both direct or indirect. Direct means you yourself are conducting those observations. You're watching what's going on. You're interviewing people. You are taking surveys from individuals. You're meeting with business owners. You're working with Congress people. Indirect observations are those that others collect. Others are doing the direct observations, and you just use those data that already exist from others. So in this instance, for example, an indirect observation would be I go out and collect some data from students on campus, and I write all these things down. I collect a bunch of surveys, and then I pass them off to students, to master students, to say, here's some data that you can analyze. So that would be direct observations for me, but indirect observations for you, the student, the master student, analyzing the data. Then the second part is explanation. So now we're really developing a theory or reasons why we're finding patterns in the data. So let's say I went out and took surveys from 100 students on campus at SDSU, and I start realizing that a lot of them are saying the reason why it takes them 5 years to graduate is because they couldn't decide on a major, or the major was impacted. So now we can come up with a theory for longer stays on campus, a reason for longer stays. If the administration was like, okay, why are students taking a longer time to graduate? They just can't figure things out? Is that what's going on? And we find, no, it's actually not that they can't figure things out. They figured out what major they wanted to enroll in, but the major was already impacted. So we're looking for patterns. The statements that we make about the social world, or about if or why something exists in the social world, have to be both empirical and logical. And what we mean by empirical and logical is that if it's empirical, it means it's based on actual data. It's based on actual observations. That means you are going out yourself and collecting those observations, or you have indirect observations, meaning somebody else actually collected those data, and they're reliable data, they're valid data. You can assert that these are good data and they actually represent what's going on. And then the second part is they have to be logical explanation. It makes logical sense based on prior theory. So like, how do we know that it's cold on the dark side of the moon? Well, to make a good empirical argument about being cold on the dark side of the moon, it has to be both based on actual data, it has to be based on good explanation. So to say empirical observations, well, we actually took the temperature on the side of the moon that's facing the sun and the side of the moon that's not facing the sun, and it's actually colder on the dark side of the moon. So the data actually support that explanation. And the logical explanation for those observations is when the sun hits one side of the moon, that sun is going to emit heat, therefore increasing the temperature on one side of the moon, as opposed to the side that's not facing the sun. Importantly, empirical scientific inquiry has a lot of don'ts, or things that aren't or don't constitute empirical scientific inquiry. It's important to note that empirical social scientific inquiry isn't concerned with or doesn't rely on speculation. Like, I think this is happening there. I think it's cold on the dark side of the moon. That's just speculation. It's not based on moral judgment, saying this is better than the other, this is good or this is bad, subjective preference, and it's not concerned with debates of value connected to moral judgment. It's not trying to figure out, is this better or worse than something else? Is racism good or is it bad? Is racism better now than it was before? That's not an empirical question because we can't answer that. That's sort of subjective preference or subjectivity. We can't say that something is better or worse because we don't know how to define better or worse. And what better or worse means to you may be different from how other people define better or worse. So we don't concern ourselves with those kinds of questions in empirical social science. Instead, we're concerned with answering questions about what is or what exists, the nature of things as they are. We can't ask questions or answer questions about whether or not racism is good or bad, but we can say, what is the extent of racism? Or does racism exist first? And second, what is the extent of racism? So we can come up with measures for representing this construct, this idea of what racism is. We ourselves can hold moral judgments about whether or not racism is good or bad. It's not something we can answer with empirical social scientific research. We want to say, does it exist? What is the extent of that thing? And let others make the judgment for themselves. Oh, wow, they show that racism includes or constitutes this, that, and the other. And it seems like, based on this research, it seems like racism is not a good thing. These are the kinds of judgments that the readers of your work can make. So why do we need empirical social scientific inquiry? Well, it's because there's a difference between the perception of what's going on and reality. If we ask somebody, what does a mass murderer look like? Well, a mass murderer is a terrorist. Well, what does a terrorist look like? And we conjure up 9/11 imagery about what a terrorist or a mass murderer looks like. But if we look at the data, FBI data suggests that our common imagery of what a terrorist or a mass murderer looks like is incorrect. In fact, the data suggests that mass murders have gone down over time. Terrorist attacks have gone down over time. But what a mass murderer looks like is not the media perception of what a mass murderer looks like. The data suggests that they are white men in their 20s or 30s. So while the media tend to highlight certain characteristics, we know that the data suggests otherwise. So this is why we need social scientific empirical inquiry, is because we need to investigate the actual data to say what's going on in the world, rather than just relying on speculation or what mass media say. This is how we get away from simple non-empirical human inquiry. This is a picture of Drunk Uncle from SNL, just to depict what's going on oftentimes with human inquiry. Human inquiry often lacks reasoning about what's the cause and what's the effect, like what's leading to these mass murders in the United States, what's increasing the number of mass murderers in the United States. Drunk Uncle would probably say, well, it's religion or a lack of morality, but without actual data, that's just speculation. So we can make these claims, but these claims may be so far from reality that we're just making up nonsense. We don't know what the cause is. We don't know what the effect is. Non-empirical human inquiry gets caught up in inaccurate observations or mistaken observations. You're looking at one thing when you're trying to explain another. Overgeneralizations, saying, well, I met one dude who got a gun and he looks like this and he shot up a school, so this is what terrorists are. This is what mass murderers are. On the flip side, you take an example from media perceptions of what's going on, for example, with these school shootings, and you say, oh, there was one guy at a church who had a gun and he stopped the mass murderer. He stopped the killer. And it gets into these larger narratives of the good guys with the guns versus the bad guys with the gun. And it makes us think, without any data, with just one observation, we say, see, if people have guns, it's going to protect people in certain spaces, which may not be the case. First off, is it a good guy just because in that instance this person was stopping somebody with the intent to kill others? How is this person different from a bad guy? Is it situational? We have one instance, but does that mean for every quote-unquote good guy with a gun, he will stop the bad guy with the gun? So these overgeneralizations are not empirical scientific inquiry. We're not looking for patterns with normal human inquiry. We just take one observation, and that's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to explain society, social behavior, and we can't do that with one observation. Empirical social science is trying to understand society or the social world using research methodology. I do want to make a point here to demonstrate that there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not social science is objective. And many social scientists, we argue that yes, it can be objective if you meet certain criteria. We know that a bunch of different topics aren't antiseptically objective. Some things are more political than others. Some things are more emotional than others. So they're not objective in that sense. But the way we achieve objectivity is through what we call intersubjectivity. So what this means is that if I were to study political participation amongst students, are they more liberal or are they more conservative in current times? The way we achieve objectivity is by being rigorous in our methods, providing those methods for others, like giving a breakdown of everything we did in our study, and then encouraging others to go out and do that same study, people from different political viewpoints or backgrounds doing that same study over again, using similar methods, achieving the same results. So we call that intersubjectivity. So if various people are doing similar projects, if we're doing science right, we should achieve the same results. And that's how we get to objectivity in social science. Importantly, some of the foundations of empirical social science are based on examining relationships. So as social scientists, we examine relationships between variables across many observations and develop explanations. So we see observations and explanations for these relationships. So again, observations and explanation. Observations, we can call these units of analysis or the level of social life under investigation. You can think back to when you look at an Excel spreadsheet, you'll have a bunch of different rows, and oftentimes the rows will represent our observations or a unit of analysis. Let's say you're working at a business and you're taking a bunch of orders from individuals ordering online. So one row would represent one person and their order. They got this t-shirt, this pair of pants, and these shoes. It cost this much, and here's how they paid. Each row in that Excel spreadsheet would represent an individual or a person. So that would be our unit of analysis. Whereas how they paid, how many shirts they got, how many pairs of pants they got, how many shoes they got, would be a variable. It would be on the column. So the rows represent our observations or our units of analysis, and the columns represent our variables. We can be at the individual level, or we can do aggregate level. I do a lot of my research at the aggregate level. So we can look at the rows being families, the rows can be an organization, or the rows can be a city or a county or a state. Let's say we were looking at the vote in the Iowa caucus, and we wanted to look across all of Iowa. We could look at the individual level and collect data for every person who voted in the Iowa caucus. Or we can look at cities, or we can look at county levels, we could look at state levels. Generally, Iowa went this many percent of people voted for this candidate, this many percent voted for the other candidate, so on and so forth. So when we're looking at aggregate level, it's looking at more than the individual. So it's summing up all the individuals under one cluster, one city, one county, one state, one organization, one family. I will note that every observation under investigation, so every observation we're making, so if they're individuals, it will have many variables. So I mentioned before, you're working at a business, you collect data from everybody who's ordering from your site, and the observations are going to be on the rows, they're individuals, and the variables are going to be on the columns. So shirts, how many they bought? They bought 3 shirts. Pants, that's going to be another variable on the next column. They bought 1 pair of pants. Shoes, that's going to be the next column. They bought 3 pairs of shoes. The next variable could be method of payment, and it could say Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, Venmo, all of these kinds of things. So those are going to be variables. Variables specifically are properties of observations that vary across observations. So if we're looking at the individual level, we can say social class varies by individual. Everyone in this class probably doesn't have the same socioeconomic status. Some may be upper class, some may be middle class, some may be working class. Even over time, my socioeconomic status has changed. But the reason we call them variables is because they vary by observation. Not everybody in this class is working class, or not everybody in this class is middle class, not everybody in this class is upper class. Age varies by individual. Not everybody in this class is 22 or 23. So because there are different values across the individuals in this class or in the study, because there are different values, that means that those values vary, meaning that it is a variable. I will note that anytime you have a variable where everybody has the same value, that means that it doesn't vary across observations, and that's what we call a constant. Let's say everybody in the class was 22 years old. Age would still be a variable in the sense that it's a column in our data set, but it doesn't vary. It's not different across observations. Therefore, it's not technically a variable. It is a constant. Every observation under investigation has many variables, and each variable has many attributes. What's going on? Variables are the properties or groupings of observation. Sex, gender, race, age, those are variables because they're clusters. However, the attributes are the specific characteristics that describe each observation uniquely and can be grouped into variables. So these are the breakdown. For example, a variable would be race or ethnicity. However, attributes are the things that make variables vary. Attributes can be black or white or Latinx or Native American for race. Let's say we had a variable method of payment. Back to our example of you're working at a business and people are buying things online. Method of payment would be a variable, but the attributes for that variable would be the various ways in which people can pay. So that can be PayPal, Venmo, it could be with a Visa, it could be with a MasterCard, it could be with American Express, various other cards. And this is how it looks. We have various variables. Age, you can say young, middle-aged, old. You can say actual age, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Sex, you can say male, female, GNC, non-binary, trans, other, we can add those in. Occupation, you can list the actual occupation, so the attributes would be the various occupations that people have. Race, ethnicity, we can say black, we can say Asian, we can say white, Latinx. Social class can be upper, middle, lower, or working. Political views or political orientation, you can say liberal or conservative. Political affiliation could be Democrat, Republican, Independent, Green. Now that we're talking about variables, it's important to talk about various variable types. And the main two that we're going to be concerned with here are dependent and independent variables. Dependent variables are the effect, or the y variable, or the outcome, the thing that we want to explain. Whereas independent variables are the things that we use to explain the dependent variable. The variable that explain the dependent variable, the cause, the x variable, the predictor. So we have an x variable, which is our independent variable, the cause, and we have the y variable, which is the dependent variable, the effect. So we've heard of cause and effect before. So something causes something else, and it leads to an effect. I put these in quotation marks, cause and effect, because it's not really cause and effect. In social science research, we can't really do cause and effect unless we meet certain criteria. But it's good to start thinking about independent and dependent variables in these ways as causes and effects. Please do not call them cause and effect unless you know that your work is achieving the criteria for causal research in social science. Without meeting those criteria, you can't call it cause, you can't call it effect. Dependent variable is the object of research, the thing you're trying to explain. Independent variable is the thing that influences the dependent variable. And how do these differ? Well, the independent variable is the influencer. It influences the dependent variable. It also is seen as coming before the dependent variable. So the x variable comes before the y variable. The independent variable comes before the dependent variable. Let's take, for example, the relationship between sex and income. And we know from at least the sociology literature that those who identify as female tend to make less on average than males in that same job and same level of experience. So the independent variable is sex, male, female, if we want to be reductionist. And the dependent variable, the outcome, the thing we're interested in, is wages. One attribute of sex, male, tends to make higher or lower than the other attribute of our x variable, female. Reminder, social scientists examine relationships between x and y variables, independent, dependent variables, across many observations and develop explanations for these relationships. When we start thinking about developing research questions, we ask one of these two questions. The first one is, how does x, our independent variable, influence y, our dependent variable? Or you can say, how is y, our dependent variable, influenced by x, our independent variable? We develop explanations by relying on existing theory and hypotheses. The explanation side of this really boils down to what we call social theory, or systematic explanations for the observations we see in society. And it is a statement about why two or more variables, importantly, these are based on what we've read in prior literature about the x variable and y variable and their relationship to one another. For example, we say sex, our x variable, is related to earnings, our y variable, because, and then we come up with a reason for why they're related. A social theory is an explanation. We don't just say that sex is related to earnings. We say it is because, and we draw on prior literature on the relationship between sex and earning. Types of social theories, we can use an inductive or deductive approach. The inductive approach focuses on developing theoretical argument based on observation. So we collect some observations and then we develop explanations based on those actual observations. So this means going out, collecting surveys, looking at the answers in the surveys, and then saying, this is my explanation for what I have found in these data. That is an inductive approach. That's what most people do. The alternative, or the old school way of doing social theory, was what we call deductive approach. It is a theoretical argument based on hypotheses or premises derived from prior research without looking at the observations. That style was like, we read a lot of stuff, we go through academic books, articles, figure out what their theories are about a relationship between x and y. Let's say we read a lot of articles on the relationship between sex and earnings, and you come up with an explanation based on all the stuff you've read. Then you go start collecting data, surveys, interviewing people, collecting data from administrative bureaus. And then you say, here's my theory. I've developed it before collecting data. I started collecting data, and my theory either fits with what I found or it contradicts what I found in the data. And I say this is an old school way of doing research because oftentimes many old school researchers would come up with these theories about how the social world worked without collecting data themselves. And you may spend all this time reading about this relationship, you develop a theory, and you have nothing to back it up. That oftentimes doesn't work, right? And that's what sometimes it could lead to cherry picking observations and things like that. So that's not a good, people still do it, but it's not the best way of conducting research. It's good when you're collecting data to have a sense of what your theory is and allow for that theory to change. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we tend to be inductive. So we collect some observations and then we let the data generate the theory for us. Hypothesis is, or hypotheses are specific statements about the attributes within the variables and their relationship. So you're focusing not just on the variables, x is related to y, sex is related to earnings, but you're coming up with directional statements about various attributes within these variables. So they're testable statements about the relationship between the specific attributes. And again, this is based on prior literature. So for example, you can say women, a category or an attribute within the x variable of sex, earn less, which is a category within the y earnings variable, than men. So you're saying one specific category of the x variable is doing something with one specific category of the y variable. A non-directional way of saying that is saying men and women have different levels of earning. It's not just saying X is related to Y, sex is relating to earnings. You're saying something about men is having this outcome. So, for example, we can say theory when we're talking about the relationship between religiosity and abortion attitudes. We can say abortion attitudes, our Y variable, are related to religiosity, our X variable, because of exposure to sermons about the sanctity of life in churches. We're saying people are going to church and hearing these sermons, therefore it shapes their religiosity, and religiosity affects abortion attitude, so it shapes those attitudes. A hypothesis would be more specific, saying people who attend church more regularly are more likely to oppose abortion than people who do not attend church regularly. Those who go more are more likely to oppose abortion. Functions and types of social research. So we have 3 functions of social research. We have exploratory, descriptive, and explanatory. Exploratory research you can think of as, I'm going to look on Wikipedia about this topic. It's the lay term for research. Like, oh, I need to research that a little bit more. Me, as somebody who likes football, exploratory research would focus on, I want to research this football player, see if they're coming up in free agency, see their stats last year. So you're just mapping out a topic for further study. You're not looking at relationships between variables. You're just trying to get more information. Descriptive research takes it a step further and says, I'm actually not only going to look this stuff up, but I'm going to report it. It describes the data you collected. I would look at one player in free agency, see what their stats were, look at another player in free agency, see what their stats are, and then report it somewhere. Write up a report and saying, LA Chargers, you want a CB who has these various talents. We see that this person met those marks, so you're reporting the data that you found. While those are all good, they're not the type of research that we engage in as master's students or PhD students. Exploratory research and descriptive research are kind of surface level. They're not really looking at relationships between variables. However, what we do is explanatory research. We explain why a social phenomenon has occurred. So we use data to come up with explanations. We use observations and explanation. In a descriptive research report, we would not be developing explanations for the things we're finding. We're just reporting them and saying, this is what it is. Explanatory research, like what we do, appears in journal articles, uses data and theory to explain why this player had these numbers. We're looking for explanations. Explanatory research is what we do as social scientists. There are various types of social science research. We have 2 types: primary observations or obtrusive observations, meaning we're engaging directly with our participants, and those can be interviews. You talk to somebody face to face. Ethnography, going out into a social space and recording what you see, what you hear, what you smell. You're interacting with people. You're not really interviewing them per se, but you can interview them. Participant observation, you're basically doing the same thing as ethnography, but you can be more of a participant in like organizations that exist there in that social space, or you can just sit back and observe. You're still affecting what's going on in that social space because people can see you and act or react to you. Primary obtrusive means you can affect the social research process because the participants know that you're there. Experiments, the participants, maybe you're not there watching them in an experiment, but they know that they're being watched. They know that their data are being collected, right? So you can put somebody in a control group, you can put them in a manipulation group, and they know that they're in a research experiment, so that can affect how they respond. You can take surveys from people. They know they're taking a survey either online, on the internet, or pen and paper survey. They know that their data are being collected. Focus groups, much like interviews, just occur in larger groups. So it's like interviewing 5, 10, 15, 30 people at once. You're basically asking questions of the entire group. And then a case study. You can look at one person's life. You've seen like the documentaries on people, whether that's Ted Bundy or whether that's Michael Jackson or anything like that. It's a case study looking at what are the various factors that led to some kind of outcome for this person. So these people know that they're being studied. So all the primary or obtrusive observations are cases in which people know that they're being studied. Secondary or unobtrusive observations are cases in which The people under study don't know that they're being studied. They can't be affected by your presence. We have secondary data analysis, which is much like indirect observation. Somebody else collected the data for you, so you're not actually going out and interacting with the people, but the data are already collected for you, and you use those data from someone else and analyze those data. Oftentimes this is quantitative data analysis. They've taken surveys from a bunch of people across time, and they say, here's the survey information, here's the Excel file, the CSV file with all the data for every observation. Go ahead and analyze it. Content or text analysis. Maybe you're looking at a bunch of different texts, whether they're books or blogs or websites, anything like that, and you're looking at the text that somebody else has produced. So they themselves aren't being affected by your analysis of their text. Somebody writes a blog and you go and download all the blog text and you analyze the sentiment, right? Is it positive? Is it negative? Are they talking joyfully? Are they talking angrily? You look at tweets from people, you can do the same thing. They don't know that they're being observed. They don't know that they're being analyzed, or their data are being analyzed, so they can't be affected. A historical case study. Let's say you go back into the history books or look at somebody's journal. So unlike the case study that's looking at one person over time and asking them these questions, the historical case study is after the fact. So you're not interviewing or interacting with the person or the topic that you're interested in. You're looking at other documents that have been produced about that topic. So somebody writes a journal, right? Napoleon Bonaparte writes a diary about his life. And then you look at that and say, okay, what's being said, these kinds of things. In the secondary, unobtrusive observations or methods, the subjects or the participants aren't being affected or cannot be affected by your interaction with their material. You're looking more at materials and not people. We have types of observations. We have qualitative data and quantitative data. Qualitative data are non-numeric data. Text, conversations, correspondence. When you're doing interviews with people, you're writing down a bunch of notes, you're recording their responses, and your recordings are then converted to text, right? You transcribed all of that text, you write it into a Word document, you look at that Word document, and then you analyze what they said. So it's looking at text. You're looking at conversations between individuals. Whereas quantitative data is all numerical. It's numbers used to represent social phenomena. So let's say you're looking at the age of individuals. That's a number that you can use. How many times did this person say that they didn't want to be here in this interview? You can take that qualitative data and convert it to a count. So you're looking at not what they said, but how many times they said it. It's representing the social world in terms of numbers and not just text or what they say. What you'll find is some people tend to identify as quantitative researcher or qualitative researcher, but some of the best and most difficult ways of conducting research are using a mixed methods approach, using qualitative data, figuring out what people are saying, converting some of those qualitative data to quantitative data or numbers, and using that to find statistical associations between variables. What counts as qualitative versus quantitative analysis? Well, qualitative is generally interviews, ethnography, participant observation, focus groups, content or text analysis, when you're just looking at what people are saying, and then case studies. These are all qualitative sorts of data. You're looking at text of what happened, who said what, and things like that. Whereas quantitative data analysis really looks at the number of times people are doing something. So experiments, secondary data analysis, the number of times somebody said something in content analysis, and then surveys. I do want to make a brief point here about secondary data analysis. Secondary data specifically are any data that are given to you from any sort of research method from another researcher. So a researcher can go out and do interviews, or they can do ethnography, or focus groups, or any kind of obtrusive or unobtrusive method, and collect those data. Then they can decide to make those data public for other people to use, and that's where we get to this notion of secondary data. You're not the primary observer of those data, you're not collecting the data, but they are provided to you by someone else. So experiments can be secondary data, surveys can be secondary data, focus groups, content analysis can be secondary data, and then it's up to you, the secondary researcher, to analyze those data in ways that you see fit. I will also point out that surveys tend to be the most common type of secondary data. I do want to briefly talk about this breakdown of types of social research. I decided to create this 2x2 graph where we outline how these research methods fare in terms of how quantitative they are versus how qualitative they are. And then on the vertical axis, I have how obtrusive they are. So are they unobtrusive or very obtrusive? So we see surveys and experiments and secondary data on the more quantitative side. Experiments are more obtrusive. Secondary data analysis is more unobtrusive. We see in this upper right-hand corner or quadrant that current case studies, participant observations, ethnographies, interviews, focus groups are all more obtrusive because they're intrusive into participants' lives, and they tend to lean towards qualitative analysis. And then here we see at the bottom towards the center, content analysis and historical case studies, where it's unobtrusive in that you're really looking at texts, but it can be both quantitative and qualitative in that you're reading texts, you can glean sentiment from those texts, and you can also count up, the number of times things are said. Qualitative analysis itself is a search for meanings in the text that you've read. Who said what? What did it mean? What are the patterns that cut across what this person said and what that person said and what the next person said? You're looking for themes, patterns of experiences, beliefs, attitudes. So you're looking at textual data to figure out what they mean. What are the deeper meanings that people are trying to draw out? With quantitative analysis, you're looking for statistical association. So you're looking at variables that are measured in terms of numbers, and you're trying to say, does the number here relate to the number there? And there are various ways you can get at certain questions using quantitative and qualitative analyses. It's just what best fits for your research question. So we'll talk about fitting your research question to the type of analysis that you should do in the next couple of classes, but this has been the introduction into the basics of research methods.